In October 2007, Metro Atlanta had about 90 days of water left. The governor called a state of emergency in 85 counties. The reason 5 million people almost ran dry sits 50 miles northeast of the city, Lake Lanier. A lake Atlanta never paid to build and was never legally promised a single drop. 3 states spent almost 40 years in federal court fighting over it. This year, the fight finally ended. And the ending is not the one Florida was praying for. Lake Lanier holds 637 billion gallons of water. It gives drinking water to more than 5.7 million people across North Georgia. It exists because the United States Army Corps of Engineers walled off the Chattahoochee River with a dam in the 1950s, and the river backed up behind it into one of the biggest lakes in the southeast. For almost 4 decades, 3 states fought over that water: Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. The papers called it the Tri-State Water Wars, and the name was not too strong. On February 19, 2026, it stopped. The United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit let the state of Alabama drop its last appeal. Anna Roach, the head of the Atlanta Regional Commission, the group that helps plan Metro Atlanta's water, said it was the first time since 1989 that no lawsuit stood between the states in this river basin. Georgia won. Atlanta's water from Lake Lanier is locked in by federal plan through the year 2050. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The water Atlanta drinks does not stop at Atlanta. It starts a trip of more than 300 river miles, down through Georgia, along the edge of Alabama, and into Florida, where it empties into a single bay on the Gulf. And that bay, at the far end of the pipe, is where the real cost of this war came due. Beaufort, Georgia, 1946. Congress lets the Corps of Engineers build a dam on the Chattahoochee River. The plan is flood control, cheap power, and easier boat traffic downstream. Water for the city of Atlanta is barely a footnote in the paperwork. The city 50 miles to the south does not pay a cent toward building it. The dam is finished in 1957. The river pools behind it into a 38,000-acre lake, and they name it Lake Sidney Lanier. Then, Atlanta grows. And grows. Here is the problem nobody planned for. Metro Atlanta sits on a bed of granite. Granite does not hold water underground the way sand and limestone do, farther south, so a region that would one day pass 6 million people had almost nothing to drink except the rain that fell and the water it could pull out of that one lake. There was no giant water store under the city to fall back on. There was Lake Lanier, and there was the river. And Atlanta was not growing slowly. For decades, it was one of the fastest-growing regions in the country, adding close to 1 million new people a decade at its peak, paving over the red clay with houses and office parks and lawns that all needed watering. The metro area climbed past 4 million people, then 5, then 6. Every one of them turned on a tap that traced back to the same lake. By the 1980s, Atlanta was reaching deeper into Lanier every single year, and downstream, people started counting the water that was no longer showing up. In 1990, the state of Alabama sued the Corps of Engineers to stop it from sending more of Lanier's water to Atlanta. Georgia jumped in to defend its supply. Florida jumped in to protect the far end of the system. 3 states, 1 river, and a fight that would outlast 6 presidents. For years, it lived in filings and hearings. Slow, dry, easy to ignore. Then, the rain stopped, and the whole thing turned into a countdown. 2007 was the second driest year the Southeast had ever seen. Lake Lanier dropped 20 feet below normal. Marinas shut their doors. Boat ramps ended in cracked mud. A racetrack that had been underwater since the 1950s rose back out of the falling lake. On December 28, 2007, Lanier hit a record low of 1,050.75 feet above sea level, the lowest it had ever been since the day it filled. And on October 20th of that year, with roughly 90 days of drinking water left, Georgia's governor called a state of emergency across 85 counties and asked the Corps to stop letting water out of Beaufort Dam. He wanted every gallon held for Atlanta. Think about what that ask really meant. Holding the water for Atlanta meant not sending it downstream. Not to Alabama, not to Florida, not to the Bay. The drought had turned an argument about lawns and golf courses into a fight over survival, pointing in 2 directions at once. By the time it broke, the drought had cost the region an estimated $1.3 billion and pushed some Georgia towns to bring in drinking water for the first time in a century. The governor held a public prayer gathering for rain on the steps of the state capitol. Then the winter storms finally came, and in 2009, heavy floods pushed the lake up roughly 18 feet, and the lake climbed back toward full, and the lawyers went back to work. Because the courtroom fight only got sharper. In 2009, a federal judge brought in from Minnesota to referee the mess ruled that Metro Atlanta had almost no legal right to Lanier's water at all, and gave the region 3 years to get an okay from Congress or go back to 1970s water levels. For Atlanta, that was a countdown to losing its water, and the clock was already running. Then, in 2011, the 11th Circuit turned him around. The court ruled that when Congress approved Lake Lanier back in the 1940s, it had understood Atlanta would grow and would need the water. The clock stopped. Atlanta could keep drinking while the Corps went off to write a formal plan for how much it could take. That plan, finished in 2016 and 2017, is the one that matters. It gave Metro Atlanta pretty much all the water it needed from the Chattahoochee and Lake Lanier through the year 2050. On paper, Georgia had won the war. It just took another decade of appeals for everyone else to stop swinging. Now pull back from the state line and look at the whole machine. There are 3 rivers. The Chattahoochee starts in the North Georgia mountains and runs down the western side of the state, feeding Atlanta as it passes. The Flint starts near the runways of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and runs south through Georgia's farm country. The two meet at the Florida line and pool into Lake Seminole. Out the bottom of that lake flows the 3rd river, the Apalachicola, which runs about 100 miles through the Florida Panhandle and empties into Apalachicola Bay. That is the whole system. Scientists call it the ACF Basin, and it covers more than 20,000 square miles across 3 states. Rain that lands north of Atlanta is the exact same water an oysterman in Florida is waiting on. Every gallon Atlanta keeps is a gallon that does not reach the coast. And the coast turned out to need it more than anyone upstream understood. The reason comes down to one thing. An oyster is picky about salt. Apalachicola Bay works because it sits right where fresh river water meets the salt of the Gulf. Oysters need that blend, a little salty, not too salty, held steady. The fresh water pouring in from the Apalachicola River is the thing that keeps the mix in balance. Picture the river's flow as a steady hand holding a door half shut against the Gulf. Behind that door live the animals that do well in saltier water, snails and drills and other hunters that eat young oysters. As long as the river pushes hard enough, the door stays mostly closed, and the oyster beds are safe. Ease off the flow, and the door swings open. The salt moves in, the hunters move in right behind it, and the oysters start to vanish. Now stack a drought on top of that. Less rain across Georgia means less water down the Chattahoochee, and Atlanta is pulling its share off the top before the river ever crosses the state line. The flow that reaches the bay drops, the salt climbs higher and stays longer. The oyster reefs, which had already been thinning since the 1980s, had less and less cover every dry year. The fall had many fathers: too much harvesting, lost habitat, hurricanes, and the lower freshwater flow that made a hard thing harder. Dr. Sandra Brook is a scientist at Florida State University's Coastal and Marine Laboratory and the lead researcher of the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative. She has spent years studying why the reefs fell apart. Part of the answer was salt, but the bigger part was that the hard shell bottom young oysters need to grab onto had mostly gone, because for years, the shells were sold off instead of put back in the water. In 2013, in her words, things really fell off the cliff. Because 2013 is the year the fishery fell apart. For generations, Apalachicola Bay grew 90% of Florida's oysters and 10% of every oyster eaten in the United States. Sit with that a moment. A single bay next to a town of about 2,300 people gave 1 out of every 10 oysters in the whole country. Chefs put Apalachicola oysters in the same sentence as Maine lobster and Maryland blue crab. Then the reefs crashed, and the federal government called it a fishery disaster in 2013. Later, a second number showed the size of it in plain view. The bay once held an estimated 10,000 acres of healthy oyster reef. By the time state biologists finished counting what was left, fewer than 500 acres of good habitat were still there, a 95% loss. In July 2020, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission did something it had never done before. It shut the whole bay to wild oyster harvesting. No tonging, no boats working the reefs, no oyster gear on the water at all. The closure was set to run 5 full years through the end of 2025, along with a $20 million repair effort. A trade that had shaped the region for more than a century went dark in a single vote. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover the water systems holding up America's cities and the places downstream that quietly pay for them every week, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. By 2013, Florida had already decided who to blame, and it took that argument all the way to the highest court in the country. That year, Florida sued Georgia directly at the United States Supreme Court. The claim was simple. Georgia, upstream, was drawing so much water for Atlanta and for its farms that not enough reached the bay to keep the oysters alive. Florida asked the court to put a hard cap on how much water Georgia could use. The case ground on for 8 years. The court named 2 special masters to sort through the evidence. It heard arguments twice. And almost nobody outside the courtroom knew how close or how far it really was. On April 1st, 2021, the ruling came down. The Supreme Court ruled against Florida. All of them agreed, 9-0. Justice Amy Coney Barrett of the United States Supreme Court wrote the opinion, and it ran only 12 pages. Florida, the court found, had not proven that Georgia's water use caused the crash. And worse for Florida, its own witnesses had pointed somewhere else. In 2011 and 2012, Florida had allowed record oyster harvests, partly out of fear that the Deepwater Horizon oil spill would foul the beds first. It had also failed to reshell, that old habit of putting empty shells back in the water, so the next round of oysters has something to grow on. One former Florida official admitted those choices bent the fishery until it broke. Georgia had argued all along that its water use was fair. Its lawyers pointed out that Metro Atlanta had actually pushed down how much water each person used over the years, even as millions more people moved in, through tighter plumbing rules, leak repairs, and watering limits. The court did not have to decide who was right about the deeper science. It only had to decide whether Florida had met its burden. It had not. Barrett was honest about the limits of the court. The true cause of the crash, she wrote, was still an open science question. And, in her words, as judges, we lack the know-how to settle that debate. So the court did not settle it. It ruled only that Florida had not met its burden of proof. Georgia kept its water. The Bay got nothing. And then Georgia's last foe walked away too. February 19th, 2026. Alabama had one card left, a challenge to the Corps of Engineers' plan for running the basin. Instead of playing it, Alabama asked the 11th Circuit to throw out its own appeal. The court agreed. The plan that hands Metro Atlanta its water through 2050 stood untouched. For the first time in 37 years, no state was suing another over this river. Georgia had run the table. Supreme Court, done. Alabama, done. Atlanta's faucets, safe, through the middle of the century. But this story was never really about who won in a courtroom. Downstream, the loss came in layers, and every layer is a real place with real people standing in it. First, the reefs. From 10,000 acres of living oyster bottom down to fewer than 500, a base that took centuries to build, gone in a single lifetime. Second, the boats. At the peak, the towns of Apalachicola and nearby East Point ran more than 60 oyster packing houses between them. By the closure, that had fallen to a small handful. Men who learned to work a pair of wooden tongs from their fathers, who learned it from theirs, sold their boats, and took jobs painting houses and fixing docks. One local oysterman, 68 years old, had started learning the trade from his father at age 6. He now does repair work on land. Another, who spent his life on the bay, said it plainly to reporters. The water, he said, does not need to reopen until it can support 100 or 150 families again, the way it once did, instead of 3 or 4. Third, the town. Apalachicola, home to about 2,300, had already remade itself twice before, once on cotton, once on lumber. Oysters were the third life. When the bay closed, restaurants right on the water started buying their oysters from Texas and trucking them in the middle of what used to be the oyster capital of the South. Fourth, the county. Franklin County's whole name rested on that bay. The seafood houses, the tourists who drove down the forgotten coast to eat oysters pulled that same morning, the families whose paychecks came off the water, all of it thinned out at once. Fifth, the country. When Apalachicola went quiet, the United States lost the source of 1 in 10 of its wild oysters. And, it fits a much bigger pattern. Roughly 85% of the world's natural oyster reefs are already gone or falling fast. Apalachicola was one of the last great ones, and for 5 years it grew nothing at all. And an oyster reef is not just food. A single-grown oyster cleans dozens of gallons of water a day, and the reefs themselves work as cradles, the hard tangle of shell where young crabs, shrimp, and fish hide and grow before they head out into the Gulf. Lose the reef, and you do not only lose oysters. You thin out the whole chain of life that was leaning on it, and you lose the natural filter that kept the water clear in the first place. Here is where the story turns one more time. On January 1st, 2026, after 5 years of silence, Florida reopened a small part of Apalachicola Bay to oyster harvesting. On New Year's morning, a handful of tongers pushed back out onto the water for the first time since 2020, under strict rules on how many oysters they could take and from which reefs. Commercial licenses went first to the Old Bay families. Fun fishing permits went out by lottery. The first season was tiny by design, running from the start of January through the end of February, with later seasons set to open each October and close again in late winter. But nobody down there is calling it a comeback. The reefs are still down 95%. State scientists guess the bay needs another $30 to $55 million a year to have a real shot at coming back. Dr. Brooke, the Florida State researcher, said that if the choice were up to the science alone, she would have kept the bay closed another 5 to 10 years. The reopening is a lifeline for the town's name as much as its bank accounts. The rebuilding itself is slow and strange work. Because so much of the natural reef is simply gone, crews are remaking the bottom of the bay by hand, barging in limestone dug out of Kentucky and dropping clean shell and even chunks of concrete onto the old reefs. Anything hard and steady for baby oysters to grab onto and grow. The scientists doing it are blunt about the timeline. A real comeback here is measured in decades, not seasons, and only if the water keeps coming. And far up at the top of the river, none of it changes the math. Atlanta still gets its water first. The Supreme Court said so. The Corps Plan says so through 2050. Every drought that comes, and they will come again, the same 2007 question returns. Hold the water for 5.7 million people in Georgia, or send it down to a bay in Florida that is only now trying to breathe. The law has already answered. Georgia holds. So the questions hanging over this basin tonight are not legal ones anymore. Those are settled and closed. They are these. Can a reef that took centuries to grow and 5 years of silence to protect actually come back with 95% of it gone? What happens to that bay in the next long drought, when Atlanta legally holds the water at the head of the river? And after almost 40 years and tens of millions of dollars spent in court, did anyone really win? Or did the system simply decide, once and for all, who gets to go thirsty last? Nobody can answer that yet. The data does not say. What we do know is small and real, and happening right now. On the first cold mornings of 2026, a few boats are back out on Apalachicola Bay. A man is standing in one of them, working a pair of wooden tongs down into the water the way his grandfather did, pulling up a thin catch off a reef that is 95% gone. And far up the same river, in a kitchen in an Atlanta suburb, somebody turns on the tap. The water comes. It always comes now. A court made sure of it. The river still runs downhill from the one to the other. It just has a lot less to give by the time it reaches the boat.